forces have used Palestinians as human shields for decades. By now, you've probably seen the video. Israeli soldiers driving through Jenin, a city in the occupied West Bank, with a wounded Palestinian man strapped to their jeep. For many Palestinians, it's a far too familiar story.
تقريبا قعدت أنا على الجنب من ربع لثلث ساعة بهاي الحرارة العالية الموجودة.
Human rights groups say Israel has routinely used Palestinians as human shields for decades. In fact, at one point, it was even part of official military policy to do so.
My first reaction was, my gosh, I've seen this exact same video before.
That's Zachary Foster, an anti-Zionist Jewish historian and an expert on Palestinian history. He says that forcing Palestinians to act as human shields is enmeshed in Israeli military culture.
We have the receipts, we have the videos, we have the photos, we have the reports, we have the eyewitness testimonies.
Israeli human rights group Beit Tselem says the practice has been commonplace since 1967. But it was during the Second Intifada, the Palestinian uprising that began in 2000, that the practice became open military policy. Israel's attorney general at the time even helped to draft legal guidelines. From 2000 until 2005, Israeli officials self-reported that the military used Palestinians as human shields in 1,200 different instances. But for years, if you tuned into Western media, you might have noticed that the phrase human shields seems more likely to be used when describing Palestinians, and one group in particular.
It's Hamas that wants to have Palestinian civilians killed, and it's Hamas that should be squarely blamed.
Since October 7th, the Biden administration has doubled down on this message.
Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shields.
Uses civilians as human shields.
Uses innocent civilians as human shields.
Continues to hide behind children as human shields.
Hamas uses hospitals and schools and other civilian facilities for military purposes.
What strikes me as ironic is that when the Israeli military enters Gaza, over the past 8 months, where do they establish their military bases? Well, they take over the hospitals and the schools and the civilian infrastructure as their own military bases, while at the same time accusing Hamas of doing precisely that.
So how has Israel been able to routinely and openly use Palestinians as human shields without any Western condemnation, while also accusing Hamas of the same practice? To answer that, let's first ask, what exactly is a human shield? International humanitarian law forbids any military, and specifically an occupying military power, from using local residents in its operations. The Geneva Conventions prohibit using a civilian population or individual civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. This protection specifically covers two kinds of scenarios: placing civilians in front of military operations and placing military operations in the midst of civilian populations. It's under the second category that Israeli and US leaders accuse Hamas of committing the crime of using human shields. After all, Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world, and nearly half its population is children. While the UN did find evidence that Hamas launched rockets from a school in 2014, it has not investigated current claims.
This has been the constant reframe of the US government and the Israeli government. Whereas if you look at the actual documented cases, they're almost all on the other side. It's actually Israel, which over and over and over again is actually using human shields, and we have the evidence.
In 2005, Israel's High Court finally ruled that forcing Palestinians to shield soldiers is illegal. But since then, Palestinians have consistently documented the continuing and widespread use of this practice.
If you literally just do a Google search and set the date filters for whatever year you want, from 2005 to the present, you will find a documented case of the Israeli military using Palestinians as human shields.
In 2007, 24-year-old Sameh Hamira was woken up by pounding at his front door in the northern West Bank city of Nablus. A neighbor managed to record soldiers as they led Sameh at gunpoint on a house-by-house raid of the neighborhood. In 2009, soldiers in Gaza City forced Majid al-Rubahi, only 9 years old at the time, to open bags that soldiers thought might be booby-trapped with explosives. The soldiers were eventually sentenced to just 3 months in detention. It's the only time that Israeli soldiers have been prosecuted for using Palestinians in dangerous military actions. And many new examples have been caught on camera since October, from Gaza to the occupied West Bank. Recent exclusive footage obtained by Al Jazeera's investigative team shows a Palestinian man stripped down to his underwear and covered in blood, searching a bombed-out building for Israeli soldiers who follow behind him.
So there's a policy of total impunity, and Israeli soldiers know that.
Foster says that blurring the lines between civilians and military personnel is more than just a military tactic. He says it cuts right to the core of Israel's national strategy.
The Israeli military also uses Israeli civilians as human shields. And this is another piece of the story that I think oftentimes gets lost, which is that really for the past 75 years, the founding principle of the state itself was set up civilian communities on the border areas. Nachal Oz, one of the kibbutzim that was attacked on October 7th, was originally Nachalim Mul Aza, soldiers standing in front of Aza. That's the original name of that community. Wherever you want to take over land, first you establish a military outpost, but shortly thereafterwards, you put civilians in those settlements. You enmesh your civilians with your military. That is how you expand. That is how you take control over land. And that has been, I would say, at the core of the Zionist ideology for more than a century.